大家好，欢迎大家收看安娜看法节目。在婚姻的关系当中财产问题一直是一个复杂而且敏感的话题尤其是在离婚的时候，财产分割往往成为了争议的焦点。很多人都认为说，只要某笔钱或者说某项资产是婚前的财产，就会自动的被认为是个人的财产。然而，现实情况比这个复杂多了。如果说资金发生混合，原本属于个人的财产，很有可能会变成夫妻共同财产，从而影响离婚时的财产分割。所以今天我们要探讨一个在家庭法中经常被忽视的概念——资金混合 （commingling of funds）。那么，资金混合到底是什么呢？它对财产分割有什么样的影响呢？今天我们特别邀请到了安娜律师楼的创始人安娜戴米奇 （Anna Demichik），请她来为我们大家深入的解析这个问题。Hi, Anna. Good to have you here today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Anna，到底什么样是资金混合呢？为什么今天要跟大家谈论这个话题呢？ What is commingling of funds and why did you decide to talk about it today?
Well, the main reason I decided to talk about it today is because I've been working on a few family law cases and it just kept coming up. And I see how emotional it makes my clients because they really expected that they should be able to get back some of the money they gave to their family, to the couple as a family. But then they find out that no, that's not the case. And so I decided it's important to discuss it a little bit so people know what situations can lead to such emotional outcomes. Now, on to the definitions. Commingling of funds is when one spouse's separate property goes to finance community property. And so all the funds get commingled, and it becomes very difficult to trace back which is separate and which is community. Let me give a definition just to make sure everybody's clear. Right? In California family law, community property, community income, and community property refers to everything acquired during the marriage, unless the couple agrees that it's going to be separate. So everything acquired during the marriage is going to be considered community property. Purchased house, earned income, purchased stocks, furniture, paintings, community property. Now, if something has been acquired by each of the spouses before marriage, it's going to be considered separate property. Also, things such as gifts from relatives, for example, to one spouse specifically, that would be separate property as well, right? So where do we see the scenarios where these things get commingled is when something acquired before marriage or something acquired as a gift to one of the spouses gets invested, gets paid into something that the family owes or the family spends, and we end up with commingled funds. So essentially it becomes impossible to trace back the separate amount that was invested.
好，非常感谢安娜律师和我们大家介绍资金混合的定义接下来能请安娜律师跟我们大家举例说明常见的资金混合的情况吗？ Anna, can you give some examples of how funds get mixed together?
Yes, so the examples I see that make people very, very emotional is when one of the spouses, let's say, gets money from her parents or his parents, doesn't matter, as a gift, and then invests this money in purchasing of the marital residence, right? Helps the other spouse pay for the house. And then it does not get traced because it is so long ago. Let's say somebody received money 10 years ago, and then years later, and then it gets invested in the purchase of the common residence, and then the couple lives together, they spend years living in a marriage, and then in a divorce. And so the spouse who invested the money thinks that, okay, I should be able to really get this money back because it was my money originally. Well, not necessarily, right? Because remember, it's been years, and it may be very difficult to pull up the records to show how much money exactly was brought in from one spouse to another, to the community property, to the community bank account. Because I'm going to discuss it a little bit later, the banks only keep their records for a certain number of years. Sometimes even more, the banks sometimes close, accounts sometimes close. So it sounds like it's easy to get proved, it's easy to get the paperwork, but it might not be really, because as years go by, if you don't keep those copies and you don't keep them organized, you may just have a hard time proving that at some point you invested that amount. Another potential situation where this happens is when, for example, one spouse invests, let's say, her own money into a family business. And again, businesses tend to be, especially as they grow, they tend to be somewhat disorganized. They don't necessarily keep all of the receipts. And so if that one spouse did not keep the receipts of bringing money into the business, that's going to be a problem later to prove that the money was in fact invested, right? So like I mentioned, hard to trace. And also if the couple is fighting and the business officially belongs to another party, it can be just really, really difficult to get proof of a specific sum of money that was invested. Same thing could happen if, for example, the family falls on hard time, right? One of the people loses a job or both lose a job, like the family struggles. One spouse starts bringing the money they made before the marriage, maybe some savings, maybe help from the family, start bringing it to the community property to support the marriage. And if that's not properly and clearly documented, then later, once the family is doing well again, and let's say divorce is on the horizon, so the family is doing well financially, but the relationship falls apart, well, that becomes very difficult to prove that certain amounts of money have been, in fact, invested in the community, in the community living. And so it's almost impossible to get it back. And of course, people are very upset because they feel that they have put in so much of their work and it should be able to get the money back since the relationship is falling apart. But practically speaking, it's very difficult.
非常感谢安娜律师的介绍，我觉得说的真的是非常的好啊。那我还想请问安娜的是，在离婚的过程当中啊，资金混合到底会如何影响财产的分配分割呢？ Anna, how does commingling affect the division of assets in a divorce?
Basically, people's expectations end up not being met. So they expect to be getting certain amount of assets in divorce, and they do not get it. And the reason is, even though under the law, they could potentially be sometimes entitled to reimbursement, specifically under the law, because the assets have become commingled, because now it's so difficult or impossible to verify how much money has indeed been invested, they just don't get that money back. Another aspect of how it affects the divorce is that the couple might end up spending a lot of money just on tracing, hiring an accountant, paying an accountant to trace back the money that was at some point invested. Also, a lot of efforts has to go into obtaining bank records. Because if you know banks, they usually, if you go online, they would only give you statements for maybe the past year, but or a year and a half. But for the time before that, a lot of times you have to request it. And if it's been more than several years, usually 7 years, the bank might even say, sorry, we don't keep our things more than 7 years, even digital. Right, so you may just end up spending a lot of efforts, and if you have lawyers helping you or accountants helping you, a lot of additional money just to establish that at some point you have put in your separate property into the community property.
安娜律师，我想请问您哈，那个人可以采取哪些措施来防止个人的财产与夫妻共同财产混合呢？ Anna, what can people do to keep their personal and shared property separate?
Well, one very simple thing is if it's separate, keep it separate, right? So for example, if you intend to keep your separate money, let's say you received from your parents, if you intend to keep it separate, don't put it in the joint bank account. Don't mix it with another person's funds. Just maintain your separate accounts and keep things separate as long as you planned to maintain them as separate. Do not mix them. If it's cash, just get a separate safety deposit box. Do not put it in your family safety deposit box. And then the second part is, of course, keeping really good records and downloading statements and downloading transactions and maintaining them in organized fashion. because like I mentioned, it sounds like it's easy, but after 2 or 3 years, people tend to get disorganized. People lose information, they accidentally erase their files. So just keep your financial records really well organized. If the plan is to invest separate property and potentially get reimbursed later on, get that in writing. Just confirm in writing that such and such amount was invested on that and that date, but it remains separate property. And again, keep those records. So keeping things separate, keeping good records, and if necessary, writing things down, getting an agreement from your partner, and keeping those agreements as well.
刚才安娜律师说到了哈，要独立的保留财务记录啊。那我想请问一下您，银行通常会保留财务记录多长时间呢？而且个人应该如何确保财务文件的这个妥善的保存呢？Anna, how long do banks usually keep financial records, and how can people make sure their documents are well preserved?
So I have not heard of banks keeping financial records for longer than 7 years. That's usually how long they make efforts to keep those records. And it tends to be general rule, not just for the banks, but for many other agencies, that they keep their records for 7 years. Anything longer than that is really your responsibility. So make sure to go get those records and keep them for yourself. Then there is also the aspect of digital bank statements, for example, transaction statements. Like I said earlier, usually you can go online, you can get those statements about a year back, sometimes a year and a half. But everything prior to that, you have to email the bank, you have to contact the manager and specifically ask them for statements for this and that period. For really long, for transactions that happened really long time ago, sometimes you even have to go to, let's say, registrar's office or any kind of appropriate office to get the paper copy if they're not digital. But even the digital statements, usually you don't get them easily if they are older than a year and a half.
好，今天非常感谢安娜律师的专业解答哈。如果说你对资金混合或者是家庭财产分割有任何的问题，一定要咨询专业的律师，确保权益得到保障。Anna, thanks again. We appreciate your insights. See you next time.
Thank you so much.